to our second intelligent living session. I guess for those that were here last month, Intelligent Living is a new series that we're launching here at Power Living, where we're just every month shining the spotlight on a new social or environmental issue that feels relevant and topical, and asking ourselves the question, like, what can we do to kind of collectively contribute to supporting or influencing change in that space, with the hope of leading to something that is a more sustainable or a more just world. So that is the idea. Thank you so much for being here. Before we get into things tonight, and before I introduce our fabulous guests, I'd just like to acknowledge that we are meeting on Kaurna lands. The Kaurna people are the traditional custodians of the lands and waterways of the Adelaide Plains. We acknowledge that their sovereignty has never been ceded. So, session number 2, looking at the idea of environmental activism and what that means in this day and age. I'm not sure about you guys, how you feel about the environment, but it just feels like there's a lot going on. Cast your mind back several years to last summer, and bushfires were just ravaging the country. Words like unprecedented were just being used on the daily. To me, it felt really symptomatic of the increasing dire and drastic nature of climate change and the impact that it's having on the environment. And despite 2020 doing its thing, things haven't really eased up there. We are 3 days out of winter, and there are areas in New South Wales that have already started bushfire season. They've brought it forward. These periods are getting longer, they're getting more significant. And I guess the question is, what can we do? Because the days of me kind of cavalierly taking my keep cup to day job just doesn't feel like it's doing enough. It feels like individual action, whilst incredible and powerful, just isn't necessarily keeping up with the pace of the world and the level of change that we need to create. So where does that leave us? How can we kind of collectively come together and harness kind of the energy that we have to influence change on a greater scale? And hopefully, where decisions are being made and policies are formed and things that are broader, we can contribute our voices there. So that is, I guess, the theme of the frame for the evening. How we can contribute to having our voices heard and actions that we can take to influence the environment on a much broader scale than just individual actions alone. To do that, we are just insanely fortunate to have 2 incredible humans who operate in that space. So I'd like to welcome in Honourable David Speirs, MP, who, amongst other things, is the State Minister for the Environment and for Climate Change, and Robert Sims, Adelaide City Councillor, and also former Senator for the Greens. So people who have experience working in these spaces, these ideas of how we can create change on really broad levels. So tonight they are very generously and kindly donated their time to come and share some of their experience and their expertise and their insight, so that hopefully we can walk away with some clearer ideas of actions that we can take to kind of contribute to collective action and change and advocacy for the things that we care about. The format for the evening is pretty fast and loose insofar as we really want to hear from you guys. So really plenty of opportunities for you guys to contribute your questions this evening. We have a live stream up and going. Hello live streamers, for those playing at home, you can type your questions into the chat. I have an iPad in front of me where they will appear. People in the room, you can use the power of your hands or also your voices. There is no kind of hard fast rules here. With the idea that hopefully we can just fill some gaps in our knowledge and get some really clear ideas of what we can do when we walk out of this space to help create something that is a little more sustainable, a little more equitable in this world. So I might hand over to you guys just to introduce yourselves and maybe give a bit of background of how you ended up operating in this space. And then we'll kick off some questions and see what we can do and find out, does community activism work and how we can do it more effectively. Sound okay?
Sounds good.
Fabulous. Great. Would you mind kicking things off?
No worries. Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for the opportunity to come along and have a chat this evening. I'd like to also acknowledge that we meet tonight in the land of the Kaurna people and reiterate their connection to this land, but also the extensive and deep importance that they place in the preservation and restoration of the environment as well. I'm David. I'm South Australia's Minister for Environment and Water. Fun fact about being Minister for Environment and Water, in legal terms it makes me the state's largest landowner. I have 23% of the state vested in my name, an area just slightly larger than the United Kingdom. So it's a big responsibility. It's a big responsibility. Of that, 21% of the state, so over 90% of the 23% is held in our national parks network, national parks, wilderness areas, conservation areas, and things like that. I'm also responsible for our state's 5,067 kilometres of coastline. I'm responsible for our water utility, SA Water, reservoirs, the River Murray. Technically the owner of River Murray Water when it passes the border at Victoria and enters here, although there's not enough if it does that. And also responsible for the EPA, noise pollution, light pollution, and all other sorts of pollution controls, and also responsible for waste management in the state as well. So those are sort of my 4 portfolio areas: environment, waste management, SA Water, and the EPA. I'm also the Cabinet Secretary, managing the business of Cabinet for the state. It's a great job. I'm the second youngest minister in the state's history. Rob and I are the same age, and we're friends, and you'll discover that as the evening goes on, and albeit from different ends of the political spectrum. I always like to clear up where my accent is from, otherwise people spend the whole evening wondering and second guessing. I grew up in the southwest coast of Scotland, at the closest point to where Scotland is to Northern Ireland. I am the child of Northern Irish parents, and I moved here when I was 17. In November this year, I will get to the point when I have lived in Australia longer than I lived in Scotland. I don't know. That feels strangely symbolic to me. It will make no difference to my life or anyone else's. One of the reasons I entered politics was because Australia was exceptionally good to me when I moved here. I didn't want to move here. Mum and Dad made me move here. My whole life and knowledge of Australia was based around watching Home and Away Neighbours as I grew up. And so I moved here in 2002, got involved in lots of things, particularly environmental initiatives along our coastline. I've always been really passionate about the ocean and coast, and that led me to run for council in 2010, went on to Marion Council, was the deputy mayor in 2011 and 12. I ran for state parliament in 2014 with the express desire to become South Australia's environment minister. I don't think anyone's done that before, and I got to be. So I'm for the last 2 years and 6 months or so, I've been the state's environment minister, responsible for all those things that I said earlier. It's a great job, it's a very hard job, very hard to keep everyone happy. There's always a substantial and real and genuine and appropriate tension between environment and economic development, and it doesn't need to be mutually exclusive, but it often is tricky. And at the end of the day, the buck stops with me when it comes to environmental policy and decision making in this state. It's with me, so I've got some hard decisions to make along the way.
Yeah, no doubt. That is an impressive area of land to be responsible for. I have 3 pot plants at home, and I'm pretty sure 2 of them are dead, so it's doing real well.
Yeah, I'm in the same camp as you, actually. I'm just thinking, yeah, David sounds like he's very busy. Look, great to meet you all, and thank you very much for having me. I also want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, the Kaurna people, and recognise that sovereignty was never ceded. And of course, this is and always will be Aboriginal land. It's really great to be here in this, what I understand is a yoga studio. If any of you see Jamie, here's my physio, tell him I was in the yoga studio. He has been encouraging me to come. I don't know that this is quite what he had in mind.
It was not specific.
I have done it. I guess in terms of background about me, I got involved with politics when I was at university. So 17, first year uni at Flinders. And the key issue that led me to get politically active at that time was the government's plans to put up university fees. So fees were being increased by 30%. And I'd come from Aberfoyle Park High School, so I was from a public school, and I was very concerned that people like me were going to get priced out of university. And it was once said to me, don't get mad, get elected. So I thought I'd get involved, and I ran for a position on the student council at the Student Association. I wasn't successful, but I ran again the following year. I got on and ended up being student president there at Flinders. And that started for me, I guess, what has been now nearly a 20-year kind of journey of being involved with political activism. When I finished at university, I worked for the Youth Affairs Council of South Australia, did some long-term campaigns. I worked as a political staffer for the Greens for many years. In 2014, I ran for Adelaide City Council. And my platform was very much around South Australia, Adelaide, really taking action on climate change, positioning ourselves as a leader in sustainability and also social justice. I was really delighted to get elected to the council. And then about 12 months into the role, one of the Green senators had to step aside out of her position due to an illness in her family. And I put myself forward to fill the casual vacancy and was selected by Greens members to be the next Green senator. And I was 31 at the time, didn't foresee myself going into parliamentary politics. Certainly at that period, it was something I maybe was aspiring to in the future. Had the great honour of being a senator for South Australia, which was a terrific opportunity. Then Malcolm Turnbull called a double dissolution election, and I lost my position after just 12 months. So I've still got the little voodoo doll of Malcolm Turnbull sitting there. I didn't buy his latest book. He was sorbent at my house. But in any case, that was a disappointing experience to lose my seat after such a short time. But I continued to be politically active and involved. I ran again for Adelaide City Council in 2018 and got back into Town Hall. And under the City of Adelaide Act, the City of Adelaide manages the parklands. So obviously conservation is a key focus for us. And I guess one thing I will say, I'm very keen to hear your questions, one thing I will say about activism and campaigning is, it's the Parliament that makes the laws, but it's the community that drives social change and drives all change that we see in the Parliament. It actually starts in the community. And I think one of the reasons why people feel so disaffected with politics is because we often forget as citizens the power that we all hold. I mean, ultimately, we elect the politicians. If we don't like the job that they're doing, we can turn them out. But also, we can really generate change, and there's been some really good examples of that, where the community have been leading change and the Parliament has been playing catch up and has finally taken action. And a really good example, and something I worked on in the Federal Senate, was marriage equality, which initially was seen as a really radical issue. And over a 10-year period that eventually became mainstream. You saw the community applying so much pressure to legislators that eventually the Parliament had to act. And I'd love to talk a little bit more about some of those tactics that we use to get some of those outcomes today. But thanks very much for the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you so much. That does lead into the first question, which I guess, broadly, does community-based advocacy or activism work? And can you think of an example of a time where it really resonated? And I guess the Marriage Equality Act is a really fabulous one of that.
Yeah, I think marriage equality is a really good example because, as I said before, it was very much community-led. And I feel like there are lots of examples of social change throughout history where actually you've got the Parliament over here and the community are over here trying to drag the politicians to take action. And I think the key message coming out of that is persistence is key. With any campaign, you need to have short-term goals and long-term goals. And actually raising awareness of an issue and building public support for an issue is a legitimate campaign goal. You've just got to be persistent and keep on working towards that. And I think that's the hallmark of all successful campaigns. And I think that will be what will get us over the line in terms of taking the kind of action that we need on our environment. is the long-term, consistent advocacy over a long period of time, because I genuinely believe that the public consciousness is changing to such a point that we need policy leaders to really step up, and that's going to continue to happen.
Yeah, beautiful. David, in your role, like how does like community voice influence the decisions that you make?
Good question, and I want to just pivot off something that Robert said about the Parliament, community being here and Parliament being here. I think our parliaments will always be a little bit more conservative on most issues at every point in our history than the community is. I think that's almost what parliaments are for, to take their time working through issues, often too long, but analysing them carefully and then acting, which leads to the community being way down the track on some of these big social and environmental issues in particular. And is that a right or wrong thing? I'm not sure, but it's a reality, and I'm not sure that's going to be changed anytime soon. I'm not shrugging my shoulders and saying that's the way it should be, we need to live with it. I just think our Parliament and the people who make up our Parliament will always be that little bit more conservative because they've got so many things to weigh up. But that's where the community has an absolutely legitimate, appropriate and necessary role in driving that sort of change. I often say to people, just contact your local MP and to let them know what you think, because very few people do. Very few people do. Probably even less people contact senators. And like who could name senators? Rob was a high-profile senator, but I'm sure you couldn't name very many Labour or Liberal senators in this state, and even less people could name upper house members of Parliament in this state. Although if Rob's successful with his bid to enter the state's upper house, you'll be able to name him. Rob Lucas is our most high-profile upper house member. He's the treasurer. He was elected to Parliament and sits with me in cabinet. He was elected to Parliament 3 years before I was born. He's been around a long time. Maybe another reason why South Australia is so conservative. But I do often say to people, contact your local MP and sit down with them, because almost everyone, unless I know they're actually quite crazy, I will catch up with them. I'll have a cup of tea with them. I often invite them to go a walk in a national park and catch up with me. Almost everyone who messages me, and my staff hate this, but messages me over Instagram gets a personal message back from me. If it's other platforms, maybe not, but from Instagram, it's pretty much immediate response from me. Your members of Parliament are surprisingly accessible, and I suppose your local councillors are as well. And so the opportunity just to reach out and give your views, your stories is really quite straightforward. Now, you'll get different experiences and different levels of interaction and I suppose authenticity. But because so few people in the scheme of things actually reach out and contact their local MP, the prominence or emphasis they will put in your particular views and stories becomes disproportionate to you as an individual. So it seems almost too traditional for words, doesn't it? But contacting, engaging, building a relationship with your member of Parliament, state, federal, Senate, legislative council, local council, it's a very worthwhile thing to do.
I totally agree with that. And can I just add, I think when you have those meetings, in terms of your campaign approach, make sure that it's purposeful. One of the things I used to find really interesting when I was a Green senator is I would get lots and lots of people contact me and want to meet, and like David, I'd like to think I was pretty accessible and would meet with people where I could. And often it would be, really, we've got to do something about climate change. I think, well, you're telling me I'm a Green senator. Absolutely. What is it that I can do, that I'm not already doing? And I think that's where, when you're campaigning, crafting a campaign, identify who your allies are and identify who your adversaries are, and approach those meetings with that in mind. So, you know, if you're meeting with somebody who is a climate change activist or someone who recognises the science and is wanting to take action, have some things that you want them to do when you go and meet with them. You know, if you're meeting with David, he's the Environment Minister, what are some things you want him to do? I'll send you a list, David. But, you know, meet with them and suggest some concrete things. I think that really goes a long way. And if you're meeting somebody who is not supportive of your cause, then you frame the meeting differently.
Yeah, it's such an interesting point. Like, I have often wondered the efficacy of contacting government members, local, like anyone in that sphere. It's super interesting to hear how accessible, and then you're right, how disproportionate it can be, where it's a bit overrepresented because not many people are doing it. Interesting about Instagram, I imagine you'll have a few people sliding into after this.
One thing you shouldn't do is use those form emails, the change.org, etc. If you see a change.org petition that you agree with, you think, oh, yeah, I should be petitioning my member of parliament about that issue. I don't look at change.org multiple forward emails, they go away, somewhere called junk. But change.org and all those various pro forma platforms, they are simply using your postcode and your email address to contact your relevant representative. You do that, it only will take you an extra few minutes to actually create something personal rather than dot points, which might not actually be necessarily where you are on an issue either. So take time to personalize it, look up that email address, and rather than doing 5048 or whatever and press return, actually write that email, and only a couple of paragraphs will do.
Yeah, right. Fabulous. Right, over to you guys, both in studio and live stream. In this incredible resource that we have up here, what would you guys like to know?
I do have a question. I wanted to ask how you reckon the food industry is related to what's happening to the environment? Because I feel like not many people touch this topic, and I feel like it's very important to talk about how the food industry is related to that as well. Not only like, because I feel like we always think about having like maybe shorter showers and this kind of thing, and we don't think about food. And I feel like it's part of the problem as well, the food industry.
Well, if you look in terms of emissions and climate change and the big areas that we need change in, the biggest single cause of emissions worldwide is the production of energy, electricity, coal-fired power stations and the likes. South Australia's trajectory in that area is really, really good. By late 2020s, that's not that long away, we will have 100% of our energy produced by renewables. That's an incredible achievement, bipartisan achievement over the last couple of governments, and so that's a big tick for us. There are other things we're doing pretty well in, waste management and things like that. When it comes to there are two areas where we need to really tackle to lower our emissions in a big way. The next step changes, and it gets harder and harder because you can imagine shutting down a coal-fired power station and transitioning to renewables sounds like a really difficult thing, and yes it is, but once you shut that coal-fired power station down, the change in emissions is very dramatic. So our electricity production here in the state is, the leap forward is tremendous. The next levels of step change become more difficult. They largely sit in vehicle transport and freight transport, and the other one is livestock agriculture emissions. And so you've identified the food production one. Now there's a real wrestle here in food production, because food and fibre production is the state's #1 economic plank, and it pretty much always has been, apart from when there's been a mining boom here and there, and will be projected way into the future. And that's a good thing for many people in our state who do produce food and fibre for the world. So we've got a real challenge there. How do we reduce emissions in that sector. I can't remember the percentage off the top of my head, but it's in the teens of all emissions produced in this state can be taken back to that food production. So how do we, and here I come to one of those challenges I mentioned where economic is rubbing up against environment. Now, we saw this week the announcement from the Primary Industries Department of some really interesting experimental work that we're leading here in the state, feeding cattle seaweed. And that massively reduces the amount of methane that they produce. Hey, who knew? How did they find that out? That's what I want. Who thought that they'd give that a crack? But these are the sort of things we need to look at. There is also then a real tension between intensive farming, which on one hand people struggle with from an animal welfare point of view potentially, but intensive farming and producing more out of less actually means less emissions, less transportation, less land use. So we've got a bit of a tension there as well. So there's a fair bit of scientific research that South Australia is leading in this area, and we're doing better, but this is one of the areas we need to jump forward in.
I guess the other angle on the link between food and climate change is also food security. I mean, as much as obviously the agricultural sector is contributing to emissions, and I think it's in recognition of that fact that we've got lots more people now starting to shift towards vegan and vegetarian lifestyles, not just for ethical reasons but also for environmental, because they're seeing that the impact that has on the environment. But then of course our food security is really threatened by climate change, because you know, you look at the impact of drought and so on, and what that means for us being able to grow our own food in a place like Australia. I think there's a real opportunity here in South Australia for us to really look at what we can do in terms of growing food in a way that is using less water and less intensive in terms of environmental impact and so on. And I know, you know, state government, federal government are looking at a lot of those different things. But South Australia could really lead the way because of our unique climate. But it's vital, of course, that we arrest the effects of climate change so that we can continue to grow our own food and guarantee our, you know, food security in the future.
Beautiful. Thanks so much.
I have a question to build on the contacting your MP. I personally do that a lot because I strongly disagree with all of my members' policies. And also, I found a really useful resource.
I'm not your local member.
I was going to say,
No, I won't mention
Do you recognise the name?
But there is a really great resource called theyvoteforyou.org. I'm not sure if you as a politician know about this, but anyone wanting to personalise a message, you can just type in your postcode and you see how your member voted on topics. And then I guess, for me, I feel like that's leverage because, you know, my member voted completely against all of the things that I believe in. But with that, you say, come with like a plan or like a proposal. But, you know, basically my ideal would be that they completely change, you know, or like vote like differently to how they did. How can you, like, what is the best way of getting your message across when you entirely disagree with everything?
I guess to qualify my comment before about going with a plan, that was in the context of if you're campaigning on a specific issue. You know, if you're working on a community campaign and you're wanting to get the MP to do something specific, have a plan. I would say if you're you know, writing to your Member of Parliament and you're dissatisfied with what they're doing on a particular issue, and I'd be really interested to hear David's view on this too, is frame it around, this is my personal view and this is my experience and this is why what you're doing is impacting adversely on me and my family and my community and is inconsistent with my values. And to give you a really concrete example of that, I mentioned marriage equality before. That was something that the Marriage Equality Campaign did really effectively, was they wrote to people who were opposed to marriage equality and said, you're denying my brother or my son or my daughter the ability to be able to marry, or me to be able to marry the person that I love. You know, framing it in a really personal way and explaining why the Member of Parliament's vote did not reflect their values. And I think that's a very powerful thing because it's personal.
Yeah, I would agree 100% actually. I think if you are so abhorred by your local Member of Parliament, though, you should get active in trying to make them no longer your local Member of Parliament.
Particularly if they're a Liberal.
Do a roast and don't get mad, get elected.
Yeah.
I guess that kind of links in with the question that we've got through on the text, which is kind of speaking to the fact that the federal government has recently put through some environmental laws despite some objections. And the question was, like, it feels like voices aren't necessarily equal. Like, how do we as community members, fabulous that we are, have our voices compete with, like, political donors and people that are wielding the significant resources to have their voices heard or magnified or amplified in different ways? Feels like there's sometimes a disparity. Like, how do we come up against that?
Well, I mean, I said before about how it's the Parliament that makes the law, but it's the community that holds the power. And I think, you know, in our state here in South Australia, we live in an environment where the media is pretty limited and controlled by one particular organisation that pushes a particular worldview. But what I think community has, and community activism has, is people power. And that's a really powerful thing. So if you can't control what is happening in the media and representation of the ideas, then it's about actually organising and talking to people in the community and going directly to them. That's challenging at the moment because of the pandemic and so on. But you know, things like door knocking around an issue, things like, you know, taking a petition to your local Member of Parliament, raising awareness, raising consciousness, and recognising that, you know, every 4 years at a state level, every 3 years at a federal level, it's like a giant job interview, really, where we get the opportunity to really hire and fire based on whether or not these representatives are doing what we want them to do. And the key thing we can do as citizens is make sure that everybody is informed about the issues and makes an informed decision. We have compulsory voting in our country, so we don't have to get people out to polling booths, but I think we do have to get the message out and push an alternative, get people thinking about the issues so that they make an informed decision. And I think that's a really powerful thing in terms of reclaiming the power from some of the vested interests that pollute our politics.
You also shouldn't underestimate the power of social media and how easy it is to actually publish and create a movement online, whether it's a Facebook group or you know, an online forum or blog or something like that. You know, Rob is right. We are not well served by the media cycle or the media analysis in this state. I'm not sure we're particularly well served in this nation, but I think we are particularly, we suffer from being a one newspaper town, and we are we've got quite a mature media in terms of the amount of media, but not necessarily enough news to fill it, and that then results in, I think, quite an immature gathering and collection of ideas that enter the media, and I think we're poorly served in Adelaide in South Australia as a consequence of that. That's disappointing, but you know, 15, 20 years ago, longer, but as recently as 15 or 20 years ago, maybe even 10 years ago, if you had a view, if you had a gripe, if something annoyed you, you had to write. The only way to get a message out there was to write a letter to the editor. And you know, you had to hone it down to about 200 words, and by the time you'd written it, you'd forgotten why you were writing it potentially, or had lost the will. And then you had to rely on the editor publishing it. That's not the case these days. we can self-publish, we can get ideas out much quicker. That has pros and cons, but the ability to create a momentum behind an idea or a project or a campaign is actually a lot easier. And then to be able to demonstrate to your political leaders that you have momentum behind those particular ideas. And if your idea is good, or if the cause is worthy and connects with people, it will gain momentum. And if it's not, well, you know, it probably won't.
I've got a question around, like, when we're mobilising as a community, do you think that there is a, like, I'm thinking of the difference between like kind of proactive and reactive community movements, like this idea of petitions versus protests. Like, is one more effective? Is there, like, should you be weighting our efforts and energies in a particular place, or do both serve their role? Have you guys had any experience with either?
I think it sort of depends on the issue, and that's where, you know, my point earlier around having very clear campaign focus and a clear campaign goal. I think a protest is a really effective way of raising visibility about an issue, and it might be, you know, you're organising a protest because you want to show people that this is an issue that's worthy of consideration, and, you know, so we need action on climate change. You're having a protest. But it might be that the petition is more about something targeted that you want to see happen at a local level that is a tangible expression of that. So, you know, it might be saying to the City Council, for example, we don't want Drivers Month, for example. Or, you know, we want to finish the East-West Bikeway, or, you know, something like that is it's a local expression of the broader focus. So I think there's a role for both, but it's about when you're doing any kind of campaign plan, and this is when you're working in a collective way with others who are, you know, in your group, it's about identifying first off what do you want to achieve, and what are some of the kind of local levers that you can pull in terms of outcomes. And, you know, it might be that you want to get a local councillor to raise the issue in, you know, town hall, or that you want to write to your local member of parliament, or you want to get the minister to give a speech on the topic, or, you know, the shadow minister, or whatever. That it's about identifying what you want to achieve, and then what are the best levers you can pull to do that.
I've never been to a protest. I probably will never go to a protest. I don't see myself as that sort of activist, and I think maybe that's why I'm a liberal, who knows, but I think there are lots of things we can do to actually advance the cause in a practical way, on the ground, doing things to contribute towards it in a practical way, and that might be corralling people into a group not to take part in Drivers Month. Drivers Month makes no sense to me at all, by the way. Rob can tell you after I get my answer. It's important everyone knows the sort of madness of it, and I'm not going to wade into it. Well, I already have, and I'm always very conscious this thing's getting live streamed. There'll be Labour Party people watching.
Don't worry, David, I'm taking notes.
So I just think there are so many practical things we can do, and for me it's about, you know, helping people to manage their waste effectively in the household, and trying to get as many people the skills and tools and resources to do that effectively. I've got dirt under my fingernails because I spent this afternoon planting trees with Wood End Primary School at Shido Park in my electorate. You know, I love the practical side of conservation and environmentalism, actually being part of the change in a practical way, and that's not for everyone. But that is where I come to this job, to demonstrate leadership through action on the ground, and that is different. I'm not into waving posters and marching down King William Street, but I am about trying to find practical examples of where I can be part of change. Obviously, I've got a leadership role in the state when it comes to environmental policy, but at the day-to-day level, I want to be down there on the ground doing things.
Can I just comment on that? I don't disagree with what David said around, you know, need for practical action, absolutely. But I guess my point is that you don't get a situation where there's impetus from government to take the practical measures unless the community is driving that and applying that pressure. So I think you've got to have both. You've got to have people who are doing work on the ground and in government and in other areas. You've got to have people in the community putting pressure on them to do what is necessary to take the practical steps that are necessary. And I think that's been the story of social change, environmental change across the world and throughout history. You look at all of the big movements, it's happened through people actually driving that in the community. And it's that then leads to the practical action.
And I agree. There's just different approaches for different people. Most people are not going to march down King William Street with a poster that they made at home. That is just the very fact of it. And we need lots more people mobilised for particular causes at household and community level, right across our city, reaching out to their members of parliament and other decision makers and finding the way to do it that works for them.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Like, I guess it's a pretty broad spectrum, and obviously, like, we're looking at change that exists on an individual level and at a community level, because we want to like influence things as broadly as possible. But that can still be done. You know, I guess community change can still be influenced on an individual level by contacting representatives and doing that. So I guess it's finding a place that people feel comfortable, because that's fair enough, and everyone should feel the capacity to contribute in a way.
Absolutely, and I think environmental activism is one of those areas where there are things that we can do that are tangible in our everyday lives that make changes, around, and it can be what we eat, how we get to and from where we need to go, recycling practices, all those kind of things, very practical, tangible things we can do individually. But also, my personal view, philosophical view, is that we also need to take on the systems that are creating pollution, mass consumption, and the degradation of the environment. And that's where the collective action and working together, I think, is really critically important.
Absolutely. Mo, do you have any help?
Yeah, I think that debate is a pretty open one that everyone kind of gets, right? That you need both in certain different capacities, and I personally lean towards the practical side a lot more. But if we put a real example that I think everyone in this room and most people out there in South Australia have thought about at some point or other, and let's just point at one: drilling in the Bight, right? So this is something which I've thought through many times, like how is the best way to engage? And I'm pretty good at engaging with all levels of politics and industry and whatever else, but that's one where I don't understand the complexities behind it. When you talk about food, David, and the economic benefits that we get in South Australia, everyone can kind of understand. It's easy to see kind of what that is. It's not easy to get right, but it's easy to understand that balance and how we have to find that balance. But in something like that, I just don't see it. Like I just see immediate destruction in my head, and regardless of the amount of economic benefit that it brings to the state, like I'd rather there were a lot more jobless people. My personal perspective, right? And I work every day to try and alleviate that joblessness. But you kind of understand where I'm coming from.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. Like, how do we, what can we do as a community and collective against like private companies that are operating in practices that are harmful as well? So we're talking about political influence that can move, but like think of Rio Tinto and you can gorge, like blowing up things for like quite specific privatized companies, like profiteering. What influence can we have in that space?
Well, I think, firstly, let me say I totally agree with you about drilling in the Bight. In my view, it's a terrible project, and one that puts our economy at risk here in South Australia, as well as our environment. And one of the things I did when I was in the Senate was get a Senate inquiry up into BP's drilling in the Bight, so that we could look at what does it mean for our environment, and what does it mean for our tourism industry and a range of other sectors. I think often what happens is these big corporations like to use the language of economic growth to try and sell their destruction of the environment. So they say, oh, this is going to create all these jobs, this is going to be amazing for our state. And really, in my view, it is snake oil because the economics don't make sense. I think we've moved beyond in our politics now, beyond this old dichotomy between the environment and economics. If it is not good for the environment, it is not going to be economically viable because you can't have one without the other. The old adage, there's no jobs on a dead planet, I mean, that is true. And for me, BP drilling in the Bight is a classic example of that because you look at all of the things that it puts at risk in South Australia and the huge disastrous economic consequences of that would flow from destruction of our natural environment and what that would mean for South Australia. So I think the project is indefensible, but again, we have got to take on that narrative around this false dichotomy between the environment and the economy and take on corporations that try and take ownership of this idea of being good for our economy and job creation. I think a lot of these claims are not true, in my view.
With the drilling in the Bight one, I think that is a really good example because it does, it is very hard to grasp why it would even be explored at a political level. I have to say, I represent a coastal electorate, Brighton, Seacliff, Firtahallet Cove, and as I said earlier, I have a real affinity with the coastline. I barely picked up anyone who was supportive of that. You know, across the political spectrum, I don't mean at elected level, I mean people in the community, no matter who they voted for, Labour, Liberal, Green, whoever. Most people, vast majority of people just thought that was a bad idea. For me, it was a bad idea almost symbolically because I feel that we've moved beyond oil. Now, there'll be oil drilling and activities with oil in parts of the world for many years to come, but I really think in Australia, and certainly in the waters of South Australia, we have the idea that we would be exploiting those resources for a fossil fuel like oil. I just feel we're beyond that. We're beyond that as a society. We were beyond that as a culturally almost, and I think so I was just had a sort of immediate position against drilling in the Bight because I thought, well, that's something old. That's old energy, old world, and we are about something different in not only in South Australia, I think more so in South Australia, but in Australia. Now, did the community's angst around that make a difference? I think at the end of the day, the two companies, BP and Chevron, the two that we're looking at it seriously, Equinor, they economic reasons really drove them away from it in the end. Now, there will always be that resource is going to always be there, and people in oil circles, exploration circles, or their eyes are always going to wander into that part of the world and say, you know, as oil becomes rarer elsewhere, does that become something that we want to look at again? I really think though, even though it was the economics that really knocked it on the head at the end, Australians, and it wasn't just South Australia, Australians made it very clear that they didn't want that. And I know that there were people in the highest offices in various political parties, not always the ones you'd expect, had real concerns about that. My view is it will never happen.
We've got to keep the pressure on though to make sure it doesn't. You know, and that's the thing. I think what David is saying is right. There was a huge community campaign on this, and I totally agree that it crossed all sides of politics. Doesn't matter whether you were, Liberal, Labor or Green. Everybody in the community seemed to think that it was a terrible idea. Yet it was being entertained by federal government, by state government. And so, we've got to, as a community, again, keep the pressure on to make sure that we don't let our environment be taken over by large corporations. And the reality is we lose things like the Great Australian Bight, we never get it back, and the implications of that would be disastrous.
What about Adani then?
Adani's exactly the same boat, and again, bogus claims being made by Adani on economic grounds to support fossil fuel expansion. And the economics of that project don't make sense, and it's been waved through by the Queensland government. I mean, I think at the moment, when we're in the middle of a pandemic, naturally people are going to be worried about jobs and job security. But the solution is not more fossil fuel and projects like that that in effect exploit our environment, are not sustainable long term, and actually make our country, I think, less competitive internationally. The solution is around green jobs and looking at long-term investment, long-term jobs. And I think that's what we, again, as people in the community, have got to be pushing our decision makers to deliver, not pushing the snake oil of, more fossil fuels, projects like Adani, projects like, drilling in the Bight, that are just so out of step with where we should be going. Ready?
Yeah, so we talked about awareness being a huge part of, the start of a campaign or a plan, and the limited information that's coming through in our news sources. I'm someone who gets a lot of my information from social media in terms of activism, and live in a bit of an echo chamber in that sense. But I'm wondering if you or anyone in the room have resources for how to find out about environmental issues happening at a local or national level that we can subscribe to, so that we're raising our own conscious awareness and able to contact our MPs and get involved.
Look, I think some of our peak environmental organisations are reasonably, I would say very reliable sources of information, because they've got to be. There's a lot of things on social media that are someone's particular viewpoint, and that it's hard to fact check some of these things. But relying on the advice and the insight and the experience of organisations like the Conservation Council of South Australia, the Wilderness Society, these are robust organisations which I don't think are interested in selling out their membership base, so it sort of keeps them focused on particular issues. They work closely with me. Other organisations, quite practical organisations like Trees for Life and Greening Australia, they have particular focus areas. But these peak bodies or NGOs of substance, signing up to their newsletter, potentially becoming a member of them. The Nature Foundation's another one. These are organisations which, to have charitable status, to in some cases to have relationships with government, and they work well with government, these organisations. They've got to have a level of maturity and credibility. They can't go out there on and sort of perpetuate fake news. So I would say to really to be sure of the information, to have confidence that you are connected with and potentially moving towards working with a group of people who are focused on the right stuff and who have influence. Signing up to, whether it's the newsletters or the memberships of these organisations, are usually $50, $100 a year, can be really worth it, and in a South Australian context would be very reliable.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that's a really good place to start. Your NGOs like Conservation Council, Greenpeace, lots of others, that really, if you're interested and passionate about the environment, can update you on some of that stuff. And just to add, in terms of contacting MPs, there are lots of, I think you mentioned one before, that I forgot the name of it, but keeps a record of how your members of parliament vote. That's a really useful tool. And I think organisations like Get Up and so on as well often will connect you with your local MPs.
I should say, on the voting record thing, we don't vote very often in Parliament, and we don't tend to vote on particularly interesting things most of the time either, and most people vote the same way all of the time from all political parties. So I think the real difference lies in the policy side of things, and the creation of policies, ideas, a vision for the state, or down to the project level, whether that's community or major infrastructure and things like that. So it's important to know how your members of parliament vote on legislation and conscience issues and things like that, but actually having a really good grasp of the policy basis, which often policies don't go anywhere near parliament, and they tend to be the more interesting, meaty parts of political debate.
For anyone who would like to share resources, you might have noticed that we've got a large Intelligent Living poster that's going to live in the common room. Every month we're going to populate that with some actions that we can take to influence change on an individual community and tackling some of those systemic issues. And it's also space for additional resources down the bottom. So if you guys have anything that you know about and are interested in and think has value, share it up there so that we can all kind of gain access to it. Question from on the text line. Regarding contacting your MP, someone who's had some experience contacting their local Labour ministers, people in charge, or I guess people in opposition is the real question. So, and the response that they're often met with is, well, it's all out of my hands, I can't do anything, I'm in opposition. What kind of pressure or conversations can we be asserting in those spaces if they're defending and saying, well, I can't actually do anything because we're not in power?
It's a really good question, and it's a good one for a Green because, of course, often we're not always.
Who can say how often?
And in interstate, occasionally in government, but not here in South Australia. But there are things that you can still do as a minority member of Parliament to highlight issues. And I mentioned before, that's where it's really important to understand what are some of the levers you can get your Member of Parliament to apply. So it might be you can say to them, okay, we understand you're not in government, but I want you to write a letter to the guy that is. Write a letter to the Minister and get him to look at this. Or it might be I want you to ask a question of the Minister in the Parliament and put him or her on the spot and get to the bottom of the issue. Or it could be I want you to give a speech on the topic in the Parliament to get profile on it. Or it might be I want you to move a motion to raise awareness of the matter in the Parliament. So those are all some of the levers that are made available to a Member of Parliament that they can pull to highlight an issue that aren't contingent on them being the government decision maker.
I spent my first 4 years in opposition, and there was plenty of 2014 to 2018, and there was plenty of stuff that I was able to achieve for individuals, for the community that I represented, my electorate first and foremost, but then when I became Shadow Minister in terms of policy development as well. So there's a bit of a cop-out to say, oh, we're not in charge. Not surprised the Labour Party said that. But I have to say, rather than get the Shadow Minister to write a letter to me, I would encourage people to write it themselves because you're much more likely to get a nice response.
We'll send David a message on Instagram.
Yeah, absolutely. But look, there's plenty you can do from opposition, particularly the second half of the electoral cycle, which we are in South Australia at the moment. It's about 18 months to the next election, when the opposition is actually formulating policies. Opposition is quite an interesting place to be. It is very frustrating because you don't have your hands on the levers of power, but there's huge opportunity in space because you're not governing the state, so you've got lots of space to do ideas development and good policy development as you lead into an election. So the opportunity to influence that is, I think, substantial.
I was just wondering if you could sort of suggest any reasons why perhaps governments are reluctant to link climate change science with real sort of grassroots environmental management. So like last year we had, I think it was in September, that massive climate change rally which many people in Australia-wide attended, and then the summer after that we have like worst bushfire records in history, and like for my generation the worst bushfires or the summer that we remember. And then recently the New South Wales government came out with these plans to avoid bushfires in the future, yet a lot of them don't seem related to the root cause of it, which is climate change. So do you have any sort of suggestions why the governments might be reluctant to link those two things, and then sort of how we can, as voters, can impact or like can change and force them to sort of look at the science as well?
I think one of the most corrosive factors in our politics is the influence of big money and vested interests, and I think that's what we're seeing with climate policy in Australia, where we have governments who will argue till they are blue in the face that, oh, this isn't to do with climate change. Your question you ask is dead right. Why on earth would they be arguing that when all of the evidence says that it's climate change and we know what needs to be done. And I think it's because of the corrosive impact of vested interests and donations from fossil fuels. And as long as they're bankrolling the two major political parties in our country, we're going to continue to see policy that is not evidence-based. So I think we have to break that nexus between fossil fuels and politics in Australia. We break that and we stop that symbiotic relationship that they have, and I think then we will start to get some necessary changes. But we've got to stop the big political parties being in the pocket of those vested interests. How do we do that? Well, again, it comes back to the people power stuff that I talked about before. I mean, ultimately, we've got to demand the changes that we want to see, apply pressure, not just every 4 years or every 3 years at election time, but all year round. And there's been lots of examples given tonight of change that's happened over time. David gave a really good one around BP's drilling in the Bight. We talked about marriage equality. I mean, I'm a big believer in the Pantene effect in politics. Doesn't happen overnight, but it does happen. So you've got to keep the pressure up. You've got to keep the pressure up, and that's all the time, not just at elections.
And I would actually challenge your assertion that that's not the case, certainly not in South Australia, because I am the Environment Minister in the most environmentally progressive government in this state's history. Now let me tell you, the previous defeated Labor government was probably the most environmentally progressive government in this state's history. The transition between the governments when Labor was defeated on in environmental policy was absolutely seamless, and we stepped it up and we stepped it up. And we continue to step it up. We never bat an eyelid at the science. It's what we base all our decisions on. We've got the best climate policies in the world, potentially, certainly in Australia, but potentially in the world. We've got an interim target around emissions reductions for 2030, leading to the big one, net zero by 2050. We've got, we are establishing strategies to get there, and because you can have targets, and we're really the only jurisdiction of substance that has an interim target, or we were first to have it. COVID sort of knocked my knowledge of other jurisdictions a little bit, but look, we're doing some really good things here, so I would challenge that assertion, because we're relying on the science, and we've got that trajectory around our energy production. We're working in the vehicles, we're working in the agriculture, we're working on the community change. We're also looking at adaptation as well, because even if we were to eliminate all emissions here in South Australia tomorrow, and or even in the nation, the planet's climate is still changing, and we can show amazing leadership here and have many case studies as to what other jurisdictions across the world can and should do. But the climate is still changing, so we have also got to make sure that we're adapting, that we're building resilience into our community. And that's not accepting change because we have to, but it is because we have to. We have to have a greener city, a cooler city, a more resilient population, because our climate is changing, and we want to take action locally and globally to slow and reverse our changing climate. But we also need to be prepared for hotter days, more extreme weather events, rising sea levels and things like that as well, and we're working on it.
Good question from Instagram. Like, any thoughts to alternatives to really binary political conversations on social media, where it's just yes or no and this kind of ramming of heads? What alternatives exist that we can have these alternative conversations that might bring people over, or help enroll people in ideas outside of what they were thinking previously?
Events like this, genuinely, I love coming to things like this, because you can have a mature conversation, and huge amounts we'll agree on, huge amounts Robert and I will agree on, things we'll disagree on, of course, but we can help each other get a bit better at doing what we want to do. And I hate some aspects of social media. I was elected on the 14th of March 2014, and on the 15th of March 2014 I made the best decision of my life, which was to delete Twitter. It is the most vile, cancerous place to be everywhere. If you've got Twitter, delete it tonight. do it for your kids. And look, social media can be very toxic. It's very binary discussions, particularly Facebook. I find Instagram just this place of bliss. It's like, put the filter on and everyone loves you. But it's very, very hard to have a mature, elevated conversation in that social media world. You can do it. I have a reasonably positive experience on social media overall, largely because I'm not on Twitter, but Facebook's all right, Instagram's good, but events like this, connecting with people, saying, I'll take you a walk in the national park and we'll talk that over for an hour or 2 or 3. No, don't have time to do that for everyone, but there are better ways.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I think, taking advantage of the opportunities we have in our country as well around, members of parliament being pretty accessible, which is great. And, I must say Dave is one of the most accessible members of parliament in terms of, being very available. And, I think that's great. And it'd be great to see more of that in politics. I think, for me, one of the things that is concerning about social media is, yes, the conversation's binary, absolutely, and it lacks any nuance. But as a result of that, there's also a coarseness and a lack of a culture of disrespect, I think, that is often developing. And we see it in all elements of our politics now. And that's very concerning for me, because I worry about the direction that we're going in and the pressure that puts on our democratic institutions. And I look with, I must say, great horror at the United States and the extent to which their political culture now has really broken down in terms of a mature democracy and the way that is playing out. So I think we have to be very vigilant in our country around those trends and how politics is developing. The solution is, I absolutely agree, face-to-face discussions like this. And, our democracy works when good people get involved with it. And, I point to the United States example as what can happen when, not enough good people are being involved. And, our democracy works because it belongs to all of us, and it's our collective obligation as citizens. So I think that's something we can do that is practical beyond just, engaging in these kind of diatribes on social media. It's actually doing what you've all done tonight, coming along, talking through the issues in a nuanced way, because that's really how our democracy is going to work and be sustained in the long term.
Face-to-face conversation is the answer, and you said contact your local MP and go knock on doors, etc. I have this sort of chat that we're having. But at the end of the day, I think, we're all here in a yoga practice. We all have similar kind of views. I think people external to here would even see some of us or all of us as hippies. How do you talk to these people who don't want to listen? Because in the end, they also have the same voting power. And if you ask me, if you ask lots of people I've had chat to, I would never have expected the federal election results that we had. And so how do you engage with those people? How do you make them understand science when the debate has been so heavily politicized?
I think it's a really good question, and I think politics is becoming much more tribal and people are getting blanket views, and it's very difficult to counter that. I will say though, I mentioned before around door knocking, and if you're running a campaign, I do actually genuinely think that's a really effective tool. And in my experience, I've had really good conversations with people, door knocking for the Greens or door knocking for different campaigns that I've been working on, where people will actually open the door and say, okay, well, you've actually come to talk to me about an issue that you're really passionate about, and I value the fact you're giving up your time to do it. and it's an opportunity to have really open conversations. But it doesn't have to just be that's in a formal campaign sense. You know, I'm not suggesting everybody step out tonight and start door knocking, but you know, you can do it in your everyday life in terms of with work colleagues, with people in your family circle, and so on. I think it's a very Australian thing. We often talk about two things you should never discuss at a dinner party are religion and politics. I actually think that's not the right approach to take. They're, you know, two of the most interesting things to talk about, but they're also how we actually shape our views and values. And I'd encourage you to actually broach those conversations with people that you know. You know, back in when Obama ran for president back in 2008, one of the things that his campaign did really effectively, was hosted small morning teas and dinner parties, and got groups of friends to get together and have one or two people in the group who were, you know, Obama supporters to talk to their friends about how they were going to vote. It's a really practical thing that we could all do in the lead up to the next round of elections. You know, with your problem with your MP who's not doing what you want. I mean, imagine if you were able to get together a group of your friends and all have a chat and say, hey, this is why I don't support this person. And, you know, can you spread the word? There are things like that we can do that are, I think, very impactful.
A couple of things. Firstly, don't assume that everyone thinks like you here. I know 3 people who come here who are not only Liberal voters, but work for the Liberal government in the political wing. So, you know, there could be not all lefty hippies. And but I think this is really important to reflect on. I think that too often we allow environmental issues to become elite issues that we can consider and engage with if we are wealthy enough, capable enough, and educated enough to do so. Obviously, that's not the case, because often it is nearly always, it is the poorest people, the most disadvantaged people, and the people who live furthest from the CBD who have the most to lose as a result of emerging environmental issues. But you know, you thought it was a surprise for when Scott Morrison was re-elected. I wasn't that surprised, because I represent an outer southern suburbs community, and which swang 5-6% towards Scott Morrison, and it was because those people, Scott Morrison, it's a bit contrived potentially, but described them as the quiet Australians, people getting on with their lives and not engaging with these issues that they've either chosen not to engage with, or don't want to engage with, or don't see as being issues that affect their lives. So there is a body of work, and I've spoken about this at the international level, about making climate change and other environmental issues relevant to everyone, not just relevant to the people who live in the CBD or the inner suburbs who can afford to have them relevant to them, who can afford to put a battery in their house and solar panels on their roof and things like that, or have a, God forbid, a Tesla car. Like, I couldn't afford it. So, you know, we have a job to do to bring environmental issues down into the normal everyday life, explaining to people how it could impact your lives, how a rising climate impacts the outer suburbs which have less trees, etc., much more. The rising cost of transportation doesn't affect people who can walk from their inner city suburb into the CBD for work. It affects people that live at Aldinga or Davern Park or Gawler or in those sort of areas. So we really have to work very hard as governments, but also as individuals and people driving change in our community and making these issues relevant, not lecturing people or patronising them, but demonstrating why these things are happening, how it will affect them, and pulling it down from the elite to the everyday.
Such a great point. I'm mindful of time, so we might move towards wrapping things up.
There was this guy had his hand up a long
time. That's okay. I was just going to ask, like, I am a lefty hippie, I guess, but and I think that you should solve everything with love and compassionate conversations. However, it really frustrates me a lot of performative activism. Like, just for example, the 4 big banks all agreeing to the Paris Agreement, yet none of them even abiding by it. How can we actually individually hold people accountable? Like, sorry, I was going to say, like, not necessarily politicians, but like politicians and big business, because big business is the biggest cause of climate change, whether it's fossil fuels, investments in fossil fuels, transport, agriculture, the big three.
Totally.
I totally agree, and I think greenwashing is a serious issue, and a very concrete example here in our state, Santos, big fossil fuel company that are a major sponsor of the Tour Down Under and naming rights. I mean, I don't know how we can have the biggest cycling event in the Southern Hemisphere being associated with a fossil fuel company. So I think what we need to do actually is deny these companies their social license. So my advice would be, from a consumer perspective, is look at divesting in terms of how you do your own banking and all those sorts of things, so that you move away from those companies and businesses that have got those links. But going a step further and saying, to use the Tour Down Under example, contacting them and saying, why are you associating yourself with fossil fuels? Why are you letting gas run an event that is meant to be about clean, green living? Call out those contradictions, because again, we've got to break that nexus between the big money. So that's what I would suggest doing.
Can I just add just very quickly to that, Dan? Because I do think that the biggest problem that we face is not from our politicians, it is from big corporations that wield their power, and they exert that power across politicians, and that's never going away, whether we like it or not. But there is a transition happening right now where the big tech companies are taking that position. And over the course of the next 10 years, we will see them heavily take that position. Now the problem is they could do good with that position of power, or they could do bad. And we've already seen some of the bad evidence that bad can happen from the tech companies. But I think if everyone's kind of aware that that transition is happening, and we exert influence over our Australian technology companies and have them exert more influence over the US tech companies and the European tech companies, then maybe there's a way in the medium to longer term to change what happens when they exert that influence over our politicians. Just wanted to kind of...
Yeah, totally. Yeah, like being mindful of the social license that we're allowing people and organisations to have, and calling them out, like finding some level of accountability and demanding it of people.
Yes.
A really fabulous idea. As we're moving towards this idea of like acting beyond just ourselves into the community, if you guys had one or two like key takeaways of what you would recommend people do to kind of support or influence kind of broader change, what would you offer?
Big question. Hey, look, we've canvassed a whole range of different tactics and strategies and approaches tonight. I think, and it's sort of got to wrestle with, is it too small, is it too big, where's your place in terms of making an influence? I think Rob and I will probably have a lot of agreement in terms of what works. Events like this, Rob used the example of the Obama dinner parties and things like that. Again, I did those in my electorate when I was running for election, and the took people out. It was called Dinner with David. It's so original. And took groups of people out for meals. And I think there is something quite powerful about sharing a meal with people, and the amount of common ground you can reach as a consequence of sharing a meal and going through that process. There's actually something quite spiritual about it and something quite powerful. So I would encourage you to look for those opportunities and feel free to almost badge them up, and create a bit of a brand around them. I think they can be exceptionally powerful. I would also we started the night on this, but that idea of building that relationship with your local member of parliament, that you will be shocked beyond, you might not like them, but you will be so shocked by, you might not like them, you made it very clear, but you will be shocked beyond belief about that ability to access, to talk, to share, and to actually build that relationship. Don't expect to meet with them every week or every month, but actually maybe give yourself a personal aim to have a connection with them a couple of times a year. And that's 6 or 8 times during an election cycle. They'll know you exceptionally well, and the ability of that relationship to actually make a difference It shouldn't be underestimated. You might have a member of parliament who has particular trenchant views about certain issues, and I've got trenchant views about certain issues, which, you know, I hold dear and wouldn't be changing them. But equally, there are lots of things that you don't hold that tightly and can be influenced. So build those relationships.
Yeah, I totally agree with what David's said. I think a key takeaway from today, you know, I'd give the challenge to everybody to have a difficult conversation with someone that you know who doesn't share your views. You know, you mentioned before about your surprise at the federal election result. I felt similarly, but I think what's clear is that there aren't enough people having those discussions with people with whom we disagree. And we all have people in our network, whether they be a friend or a family member, we know votes differently to the way that we do. You know, my challenge to you would be to go away and have a chat with them and talk them through why you feel the way that you feel and see if you can convince them to change. And the other point I would leave you on, and it's similar to David's, is again that reminding people around our political system only works when good people get involved, and the fact that our politicians are here to serve us as constituents. We're their employer. It's not the other way around, and I think sometimes we forget in political discourse, we often hold politicians up here as if they're a removed group. AOC, I'm not sure if anyone here is a follower of hers. I'm a big fan of hers. And she says this all the time. She's like, the role of a politician is actually to serve the community. And I think we need to hold politicians to account, not just every 3 or 4 years, throughout the cycle, remind them of who they are there to represent and what our expectations are.
Beautiful. Gentlemen, thank you so much for generously offering your time and expertise and insights tonight. Guys, can we give them a huge round of applause? So from here, we have that Intelligent Living poster board outside. That is quite a living document. So we're going to put up some information if you want to know more about divesting, or if you want to know more about how to contact your politician, or if you have any fabulous resources, like contribute to it, share ideas, like let us know how many letters you've sent, how many, you know, like let's kind of track what this community is doing. I think it's a really exciting part of it, and we can keep each other to account, which is a beautiful thing. So the stuff that we're talking about doesn't just like start and finish in this room, in this conversation. Next month, we're going to do this all over again. It's going to be a little different. We're going to team up with the Ripple Effect, which is another kind of branch of the Power Living family. They do micro grants every month for like community organizations or any kind of like social initiative or movement. And we're going to have a bit of a pitch night. We're going to invite a bunch of them to come along and just chat about the work that they're doing, so that we can be a bit more aware of like what people in the community are doing to impact, you know, the community that we live in, but also so we can bring our attention and support these guys in doing the stuff that they do. So should be a bit of fun, a bit kind of like Shark Tank-esque without the ferocity. Who knows? Maybe we'll get spicy. Who can say? But share the word. If anyone's interested, they can apply through the website, the Ripple Effect on the Power Living website. If you want to submit an application, just for an opportunity for a microgrant. I know we've got some people in the room that have applied and been successful in that. It's a pretty cool thing to do. So we'll hopefully get a bunch of people and find out what people in the community are doing to make this a more sustainable, workable landscape that we're living in. But for you guys, for faces that we saw last month, for faces that we are seeing for the first time, thank you so much. You guys are brilliant. It's a real joy to share this space with you. So thanks for coming along. See you again soon.
Sorry? Steph? Yeah, sitting there long. Yeah, good. How are you?
Good, thank you.
Yeah. It's almost, I think